Detective Russ Caldwell had been with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office for nearly 2 decades when the call came in about a suspicious death in a quiet suburb north of Birmingham. He was not the kind of investigator who took anything at face value. In fact, his peers teased him for his tendency to approach each crime scene as if it were the ultimate puzzle, a labyrinth of evidence that needed meticulous untangling. His reputation for thoroughness was well deserved, and when the report of a shooting in Morris reached his desk on a cold evening in 2015, he canceled all other plans. This was no simple break-in, he sensed. It was the sort of tragedy that could tear a close-knit community to shreds. When Caldwell arrived on the scene, the immediate impact of what had happened hit him with full force. The victim, identified as Michael Reese, had been found in the kitchen area by first responders. His wife, Cindy Reese, was outside, distraught, sobbing about an intruder who had broken into their home. Neighbors huddled in small clusters on the street, trying to comfort one another and figure out how a place as small and ordinary as Morris could be the stage for such violence. It was an incongruity that Caldwell could feel in his bones. Morris was the kind of town where you recognized nearly every face in the grocery store and rarely locked your door when you popped out for a quick errand. It was, many said, the friendliest spot in the county. Yet, as the detective surveyed the chaos, he spotted inconsistencies that would soon define the entire course of the investigation. Some items appeared randomly strewn, as if the house had been ransacked, but no obvious valuables seemed to be missing, an odd detail if this was a robbery gone wrong. The manner in which Michael's body was positioned also raised immediate doubts in Caldwell's mind about the story of an intruder surprising the couple. He mentally cataloged every piece of furniture that looked out of place, every door that should have been locked but wasn't, every firearm in the house that could be accounted for. Even Cindy's demeanor struck him in unusual ways. She was trembling, certainly, but there was a slight mismatch between her words and her expression, a subtle incongruity that set him on edge. Whether from shock or something else, she couldn't quite answer his initial questions with the clarity he would expect from someone who had just lived through a home invasion. Within the first hour on scene, Caldwell recognized that nothing about this death was straightforward. The victim was a respected local man, the wife was well known at church, and the suspicion swirling in the cold Alabama air felt heavy. The challenge was clear: gather the clues, break through the walls of fear and possible deception, and bring clarity to a case that threatened to become one of the most talked-about murders in Jefferson County's recent history. Even before night fell, the detective suspected this investigation would test every skill he had acquired. It was the beginning of a painstaking journey in search of the truth, one that would eventually unearth secrets of betrayal, loneliness, and desperation far beyond anything he could have anticipated. As authorities cordoned off the scene, and local news reporters began to sense a significant story brewing, the stage was set for a twisting legal and emotional saga. Detective Caldwell would spend months unraveling the puzzle pieces of Michael Reese's death. What he did not yet know was how profoundly this case would affect everyone involved, from the grieving families to the entire Morris community. The challenge would lie not only in uncovering who had pulled the trigger, but in understanding why it had happened in a place so cherished for its sense of community and moral grounding. By the end of it all, Morris would never be the same. In order to comprehend the gravity of that fateful evening, one must first understand Michael Reese himself, a devoted husband, a trusted friend, and the unwitting victim of a plan that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Yet no portrait is complete without exploring the complexity of Cindy Reese, a woman whose background and choices would eventually become the focus of public scrutiny. Their stories and personalities, their faith and relationships, and the events leading up to that one irreversible moment formed the bedrock of a case that would be scrutinized by detectives, legal teams, and an entire community left grappling for answers. Michael Reese grew up in rural Alabama, surrounded by the kind of traditional values that shaped him into the man he would become. Born in 1974, he spent his early childhood on a modest family farm an hour north of Birmingham. By most accounts, his upbringing was loving but strict. His parents, Two deeply religious individuals who valued hard work taught him the importance of responsibility and compassion. As a child, Michael was the boy who would help neighbors mow their lawns without expecting a dime in return, who would shovel gravel for older church members after heavy storms. The essence of that upbringing never left him. Friends described him as the kind of person who always made time for others, no matter how busy he was with his own obligations. If he did not have children himself, he would look forward to having children in the future. During his adolescent years, Michael's social circle expanded in typical small-town ways. Youth group gatherings, part-time farm work, high school football games under the Friday night lights. He never strayed far from the values instilled in him at home. Academically, he was solid, if not spectacular, with teachers remembering him as polite and steady rather than flashy or overtly ambitious. In his late teens, he began dating sporadically, but he was never known to be a ladies' man, preferring to focus more on forming genuine connections than on fleeting relationships. He seemed to crave stability from a young age, an anchor to the swirling uncertainties of teenage life. After graduating high school in 1992, Michael briefly attended a local community college, studying courses in business administration, but finances were tight. His family needed him to contribute, and the notion of working an honest job appealed to him, so he decided to step away from full-time schooling. He found a job with a regional manufacturing company, starting in a basic position that required manual labor and a lot of patience. Michael thrived in that environment, forging close friendships with his co-workers and developing a reputation for reliability. He was the man who would volunteer for the less pleasant shifts if someone needed time off. Over the years, he rose modestly through the ranks, eventually overseeing a small team of employees. When Michael was 25, he met Cindy through church events. Their initial bond was formed over a youth group project they both volunteered to help with. While neither came from a privileged background, they shared a deep-rooted faith, a love for the quiet rhythms of small-town life, and a genuine interest in forming a partnership grounded in mutual respect. After a year of dating and courtship activities that mostly involved attending church enclaves and gatherings, cooking meals at home, and occasionally going to a local restaurant on special occasions, they decided to get married. They saw their union as the next logical step in the life they were building together. Steady, purposeful, and guided by what they believed was divine direction. Friends often joked that Michael was the calm to Cindy's storm. If a minor conflict arose in their social circle or within the extended family, Michael was the peacemaker. He rarely argued, preferring instead to find common ground or diffuse tension with a well-timed quip or a modest compromise. His even-tempered nature made him an ideal mediator. At church functions, Michael was the person who stacked chairs, cleaned up without being asked, and quietly mentored younger kids. His life revolved around service, modest comfort, and the hope of a stable future with Cindy by his side. Together they purchased a modest home in Morris, a town they believed would be the perfect backdrop for the life they envisioned, eventually starting a family, strengthening ties with a local congregation, and immersing themselves in the supportive arms of a community that shared their core values. Yet as the years passed, Michael encountered challenges that tested him. The manufacturing plant went through a series of cutbacks. He dealt with stress as hours fluctuated, pay raises were put on hold, and rumors of layoffs haunted the workforce. Despite these anxieties, he clung to his faith. His co-workers recall that in the most uncertain times, Michael maintained a hopeful outlook. He often remarked that the best way to handle adversity was to redouble one's efforts at work and in prayer. For him, faith wasn't merely a matter of Sunday mornings, it was a daily guiding principle. On the social side, Michael's circle remained relatively small. He had a handful of close friends, mostly from work and church, and while he participated in group events, he rarely ventured far outside his comfort zone. He was a homebody, content to spend weekends doing house projects, grilling outside, or visiting his parents and siblings, who lived an hour's drive away. For Michael, contentment was found in routine. There was no yearning for fancy vacations or material extravagances. He simply wanted enough to get by, a home filled with love and a sense of purpose in helping others where he could. In many ways, Michael's life was shaped by the people around him. He was close to his parents, to Cindy's family, and to a tight circle of church friends. He attended Sunday services without fail, led small group discussions occasionally, and even contributed time and money to mission trips that others embarked upon when he couldn't afford the journey himself. Even as challenges in life arose, from minor financial strains to interpersonal struggles, Michael took them in stride. He believed wholeheartedly that every challenge was a test of faith, a chance to grow deeper in one's relationship with God. Those who knew Michael say that, in the final months of his life, he seemed largely the same. If there were any cracks in his outward persona, any hidden worries or deep-seated struggles, they weren't visible to most. He appeared to be on steady ground, continuing his usual routines, working, attending church events, and supporting Cindy in her efforts as she volunteered at church and spent time with friends. Naturally, no one can see into the private corners of a person's heart, and Michael rarely burdened others with talk of marital discord or personal worry. If he carried secrets, he did so quietly. As for the social connections that defined Michael's life, the clearest and most defining one was his marriage. He also stayed in close contact with his immediate family, whom he visited at least once a month. Other significant relationships included a best friend he'd known since high school, a couple of co-workers who met up with him weekly for coffee, and a handful of church acquaintances he routinely assisted with small tasks. If Michael's phone chimed with a late-night call from someone in need, he would answer without hesitation. It was his nature to be helpful, almost to a fault. This quiet selflessness was part of what made the news of his death so devastating to those who knew him. On the day he died, Michael's timeline was in many ways typical for him. He rose early, left the house to do some errands before heading to work, and spent time in the late afternoon finishing tasks at home. According to colleagues, he clocked out at a reasonable hour, planning to spend the evening with Cindy. Nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be happening. If he sensed any tension at home, he did not confide it to his co-workers. Throughout the day, he took a few phone calls from family members, which he often did just to say hello or check on them. In short, his day was the picture of normalcy. That evening, various neighbors reported hearing a loud sound that they later realized could have been a gunshot. It was around dusk, light was fading over Morris, and people were preparing for dinner. According to Cindy's initial account, she and Michael were at home when an intruder burst in, leading to a struggle that ended in Michael's death. Yet from the standpoint of a typical suburban evening, everything about that alleged scenario seemed unusual. The Reeses were never known to entertain many visitors at night, so a violent intrusion felt all the more shocking. By most appearances, Michael's final hours were marked by no significant change in his demeanor. He apparently changed into comfortable clothes after returning home from work, talked casually with Cindy about dinner plans, and then ended up in the kitchen. The last documented communication he had outside the home was a brief text message exchange with a coworker about a scheduling matter. If he had any inkling of danger, he did not express it. Thus, the abrupt end to his life left everyone stunned. In the aftermath of his death, members of the church community were traumatized. Co-workers gathered in hushed break rooms to share their grief, and family members were left to piece together an unthinkable puzzle. How could such a steady, dependable man be gone under such violent circumstances? In trying to understand Michael's perspective, one can infer that he likely never saw the threat coming. There is no evidence he was fearful for his life that day, no reason to believe he had made any enemies, and no sign that he suspected the person closest to him might harbor harmful intentions. His trust, ironically, may have been his undoing. Friends who visited the house in the weeks before the murder noted nothing out of place, no tension thickening the air. In the immediate sense, he was probably comfortable and secure in his marriage. If he suspected Cindy had any secrets or was carrying on any hidden relationships, he never voiced such concerns, at least not publicly. His state of mind, as far as friends and family could determine, was stable and content leading up to his final hours. Michael was not reported to be depressed, overly anxious, or prone to dark moods. If he struggled with stress, he seemed to contain it well. He had supportive networks through church and work, and he possessed a strong faith in God that gave him a sense of purpose, even during uncertain times. All of it underscores the final tragedy. He was unprepared for the betrayal that was about to unfold in the very home he believed to be his sanctuary. Where Michael's life seemed grounded and predictable, Cindy Reese's background and experiences diverged in revealing ways. Born in 1976, she spent most of her childhood in a similar rural environment, though her upbringing had a few more disruptions than Michael's. Her parents split when she was young, forcing her to bounce between different living arrangements. She grew up learning to adapt to changing financial realities and shifting parental figures, an environment that cultivated a certain emotional independence. In her teenage years, she was perceived as outgoing, a stark contrast to Michael's quieter nature. After high school, Cindy took a series of short-lived jobs, some at local diners, others at retail stores, before she settled on working as an administrative assistant at a nearby corporate office. She had a knack for organization and an easy way of talking to people that served her well in customer-facing roles. Still, she struggled to find real fulfillment. Outside of work, she formed friendships more readily than Michael did. He was the type to invite neighbors over for coffee or attend the small social get-togethers that sprang up in the area. The day she met Michael at church, Cindy was juggling a variety of volunteer responsibilities, helping organize potlucks, assisting with youth programs, greeting newcomers. By all accounts, she took her faith seriously, viewing it both as a spiritual foundation and a social network. The pair seemed to complement each other well enough in the beginning. Where Michael was cautious and methodical, Cindy was impulsive and emotionally driven. That dynamic, in its early stages, provided each with traits they admired in the other. Friends recall how Cindy's eyes lit up whenever she talked about Michael in the first few years of their marriage. Though they had different temperaments, they shared a commitment to their church community and a belief that marriage was a sacred bond. Over time, though, Cindy's restlessness began to show. She sometimes admitted to friends that she wondered what else was out there for her, beyond the routine of small-town life, beyond the same circles she'd grown up in. When the local church began to undergo leadership changes and expand certain programs, Cindy jumped at the chance to take on more responsibilities, forging deeper connections that extended beyond her marriage. She found a sense of validation in being needed and respected in a broader context, not just as Michael's wife. Some who knew her well speculate that she eventually began craving a level of excitement or emotional intensity that Michael's stable, predictable presence simply did not offer. Cindy's psychological makeup, as described by people who crossed her path, included a desire for affirmation and attention. She was someone who liked to be seen as helpful, generous, and socially active. Yet beneath that exterior, there was also an undercurrent of insecurity. She worried about not measuring up, about aging without having accomplished much of significance. Over the years, the difference between her outward persona and her internal doubts may have created mounting tension. She rarely voiced these fears in plain language, but glimpses emerged in conversations about her dissatisfaction with certain aspects of her life. As she devoted more and more time to church activities, Cindy formed ties with members who admired her organizational skills. She helped plan charity events, prepared Sunday school materials, even took part in choir or music ministry, depending on the church's needs. In the process, she forged bonds that Michael, focused on his work and content with a quieter existence, did not share. It was around this time, say those who observed closely, that she began to drift further from the consistent presence Michael provided. If marital disagreements arose, Cindy seemed more inclined to confide in friends rather than resolve issues directly with her husband. Although they never had children, which some believed placed additional pressure on Cindy to find meaning and fulfillment elsewhere, the couple continued attending services together. Publicly, they still presented the facade of a united, if understated couple, deeply rooted in faith. By the time the turmoil in Cindy's personal life began to bubble to the surface, her social sphere was well established. She was known to many in Morris as someone who could be approached for a chat, who could lend a sympathetic ear, or who might organize a meal train for a family in crisis. However, beneath this socially engaged persona, her personal circumstances started to change. Rumors emerged that Cindy was developing an especially close friendship with a man at church, a friendship that some people whispered was drifting into an extramarital affair. Whether out of denial or an attempt at secrecy, she did not openly acknowledge any impropriety in the beginning, but the gossip grew louder when they were seen alone in places that raised eyebrows. If Michael sensed something off, either he kept it to himself or confronted her in private. No public conflict arose. The facade held. As the months wore on, Cindy's behavior became more erratic, according to a few close friends who later provided statements to investigators. She would vacillate between deep remorse and newfound elation, sometimes in the same afternoon. She talked vaguely about feeling trapped and unhappy, about longing for a fresh start, or the opportunity to discover who she really was. Simultaneously, she made efforts to hide any tangible evidence of her shifting affections. She remained outwardly polite, still appeared at Sunday services with Michael, and continued performing wifely duties, albeit with a growing sense of detachment. Speculation suggests that Cindy's internal conflict, her restlessness, dissatisfaction, and desire for something more, eventually evolved into a dangerous mindset. In certain moments, she might have fantasized about a life where Michael simply wasn't around, a scenario that could release her from the constraints she felt. This undercurrent, coupled with an alleged affair that some church acquaintances suspected, set the stage for a critical turning point, the possibility that she would not only consider, but also plan a way out of her marriage. The precipitous leap from discontent to criminal intent can occur when emotional instability, external temptation, and a perceived lack of better options collide. In Cindy's case, the question remains whether she fully grasped the finality and moral gravity of what she considered, or whether her emotional spiral simply pulled her deeper into a plan she naively believed she could execute without getting caught. Within the broader social context, Morris was a small, religiously conservative community where rumors traveled quickly and reputations were fragile. People were reluctant to confront Cindy openly. Even those who suspected she might be struggling in her marriage often believed that ultimately she was a decent person who would not let her moral compass slip too far. They had no idea the extent to which certain seeds of desperation and romantic idealization might have taken root in her mind. In public, Cindy remained an active churchgoer, a presence at bake sales and charity drives, a woman whom many considered a friend. At first, her transformation into a perpetrator of murder seems unimaginable. Yet it would be a mistake to assume that individuals who commit such acts always display overt danger signals or malevolence in an easily recognizable way. Cindy's brand of criminal evolution followed a subtler arc, conceived in secrecy, fueled by dissatisfaction, and increasingly rationalized by an internal narrative that set her on a path of no return. Her final shift from ordinary community member to murder suspect was not a single moment, but a slow, volatile build, fueled by circumstances that included a stalled marriage, an intoxicating emotional connection with someone else, and an environment that, ironically, offered both moral guidance and multiple social escapes. Those who saw Cindy in the days immediately before Michael's death later recalled her as appearing distant, preoccupied, yet not distraught. She seemed to be going through the motions of daily life, work, church, errands, without letting anyone see the storm that was brewing inside her mind. She told no one of any plans, but some acquaintances remarked that she hinted at big changes coming in her life. To a visitor that addressed her late husband, Matthew Starr told me that Mary Miller told him once that Michael was the one person he couldn't really talk to. When pressed, she would brush the subject aside with vague platitudes about leaving it in God's hands or trusting God's plan. There was no visible sign, no slip of tongue that directly implicated her. Whatever final mental break occurred, whatever last moral barrier she crossed, likely happened quietly, behind closed doors. Perhaps she believed she could orchestrate a new life without dealing with the messy aftermath. Or maybe, in a moment of reckless desperation, she decided to rid herself of the man she had once promised to love forever. In the months leading up to Michael's death, the everyday texture of life in Morris remained what it had always been: humble, friendly, and guided by strong religious values. Yet beneath the surface of that calm exterior, the conditions that would lead to murder were steadily aligning. Michael, content in his routine, trusting in his wife, had no idea he was living on borrowed time. Cindy, caught in a web of conflicting desires, fed by an affair and a need for affirmation, drifted toward a dangerous conclusion. The stage was set, the players were in place. All that was needed was a trigger, something to spark the plan that was quietly gestating in Cindy's mind. No one can say for certain what the last straw was for Cindy, or how she justified her actions, but in considering the events that unfolded immediately before the crime, certain details stand out. The build-up period was marked by an increasingly strained marriage that, while not overtly confrontational in public, was haunted by distrust and emotional withdrawal. Friends observed Michael as steady, but occasionally concerned, his eyes searching Cindy's face as if he sensed she was emotionally elsewhere. Cindy herself was unusually tense at times, snapping at small inconveniences. She sometimes left church gatherings early or appeared lost in thought, fiddling with her phone or texting someone discreetly. A friend once asked if she was okay. She replied that she was simply dealing with a lot, but did not elaborate. Few saw any outright hostility between the couple, although Michael's mother later said she sensed a subtle shift in Cindy's attitude. Where she had once been quick to share updates about daily life, she now grew silent or even defensive. If asked about their marriage, Cindy would change the subject or abruptly walk away. Michael, on the other hand, confided to a close coworker that he felt Cindy was distant, and he worried about her state of mind. He was considering suggesting marriage counseling, though he wasn't sure how to bring it up without angering her. The coworker urged him to seek help sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, Michael never got that chance. Behind the scenes, Cindy's alleged affair accelerated. Phone records, later scrutinized by law enforcement, showed a spike in text messages and calls between her and another individual, possibly in the hours or days leading up to the crime. At the time, Cindy would hide her phone, mention errands she needed to run alone, or find excuses to spend time away from home. The tension with Michael grew taut, though outward arguments apparently remained minimal. If a confrontation did occur, it likely happened away from prying eyes. A handful of key events may have triggered the crime. One was an argument that possibly occurred a week before Michael's death, an argument that some neighbors overheard through the thin walls of houses spaced closely in that suburban stretch. No one reported it to the police, since domestic spats aren't unheard of, and the details of that argument remain speculative. Another potential trigger was the approach of a church event, in which both Michael and Cindy were expected to participate. If Cindy felt pressure or shame about continuing to present themselves as a happy couple, it might have heightened her desperation for an escape. The woman worked as a waitress at a Chicago medical office, then married a cemetery doctor. In the final days before the murder, Cindy's internet search history, later retrieved by investigators, revealed a disturbingly specific pattern. She read articles about breaking into a home, about staging a robbery, even about ballistic evidence. While none of this research was definitive proof of intent in isolation, it fit into a mosaic that investigators would reconstruct in due time. She reportedly checked local crime reports, maybe to glean how law enforcement responded to residential break-ins. There was also a search related to firearms. Michael owned a gun, something not unusual in a rural Alabama household, but precisely how Cindy planned to use that fact remained unknown until the moment everything came together. Exercise. When the critical day arrived, Michael went to work as usual, apparently unaware that his fate was sealed. Cindy spent part of the day running errands, which investigators would later piece together from various store receipts and surveillance footage. She bought groceries, though in smaller quantities than usual, as if she didn't plan to be cooking much after that evening. She made a phone call to someone at church, discussing some volunteer duties, but seemed distracted. Eyewitness accounts suggest she was calm, even somewhat detached, displaying no outward sign that she might be on the brink of committing an irreversible act. By the time Michael arrived home, the stage was set for what investigators believe Cindy had been planning for at least several days, if not longer. Though the exact sequence of events inside the Reese home that night remains partially speculative, certain elements are clear from forensic analysis and law enforcement interviews. Michael was found in the kitchen, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. There were signs in the house consistent with an attempt to make the crime look like a botched burglary. Drawers pulled open, valuables left in the middle of the floor as if dropped by a startled thief, yet the ruse was sloppily executed. Items that a real burglar would have likely taken, electronics, purses, easily fenced goods, remained in plain sight. It appears that Cindy confronted Michael at some point, possibly startling him while he was looking into the refrigerator or bending down to pick something up. The angle of entry for the bullet suggested he never saw it coming. The firearm used was one that investigators later traced back to the household. The immediate aftermath, as reconstructed by detectives, saw Cindy leaving certain indicators that a struggle had occurred, yet the physical evidence of an actual confrontation, overturned furniture, scattered objects, did not match her initial testimony. The carefully staged scene did not align with the typical chaos of a real home invasion, especially one that escalates to murder. The method itself, shooting Michael in the back of his head, revealed a chilling degree of calculation. This was not a defensive shot, fired in the heat of a sudden violent altercation. It resembled an execution, undertaken in a moment when Michael was vulnerable. The coldness of that act, investigators would later note, stood in stark contrast to the religious devotion both Michael and Cindy had often publicly displayed. If the murder was indeed premeditated, the question became, could Cindy have been so certain she had no other options? Or did she believe this was the cleanest path to the new life she coveted? Catherine took a deep breath, aware of whatever was in the air. After the gunshot rang out, Cindy's immediate reaction provided critical clues. She made a 911 call for help in her voice, reportedly frantic, and claimed a burglar had broken in and shot Michael. Yet, to responders on the scene, her story seemed rehearsed. She did not have the wild panic they often see from terrified victims of home invasion. Investigators noticed that specific details she gave, like hearing a forced entry or seeing the perpetrator flee, did not match the physical evidence at the house. Nonetheless, that was her initial explanation, and she stuck to it for as long as she could. Her interactions with neighbors in the immediate aftermath were described as off, with some stating that her shock appeared partially manufactured. In the hours and days that followed, Cindy's actions inadvertently left a trail of clues for detectives. Her phone records, her internet searches, her inconsistencies in retelling what had happened, all these pieces provided a path that would eventually point directly to her culpability. She even contacted certain friends to talk about the tragedy, often in a manner more focused on her own emotional state than the grief of losing her husband. One friend told authorities that Cindy seemed cold when discussing Michael's death, more concerned about how people viewed her than about the loss itself. It was a red flag that many, in the shock of the moment, failed to process. The turning point for investigators came when they realized how poorly staged the burglary was. Nothing about the scene truly indicated a forced entry. There were no footprints outside in areas where a burglar might have prowled. Valuables remained. The bullet's trajectory pointed to Michael being shot at close range, likely without warning. And for a burglar to gun someone down execution style and then leave almost immediately with no haul was bizarre. It defied common sense. The shallow ransacking left the impression that the perpetrator wanted to telegraph robbery, but had not taken the time to learn what such a crime might realistically look like. Yet, in the days that followed, Cindy seemed to go through the motions of a grieving widow, attending initial memorial arrangements and speaking to family members. Yet she made notable slip-ups under police questioning. First, she could not clearly describe the intruder. Her story wavered between describing him as tall and masked to disclaiming that she barely got a look. Second, she mentioned hearing Michael call out, which clashed with the angle of the gunshot wound that suggested no verbal exchange occurred before the fatal shot. Detectives took note of every discrepancy. In interviews with local reporters, Cindy's demeanor came across as oddly distant and at times defensive. It was as if she were more concerned about absolving herself in the court of public opinion than truly mourning the life of her husband. Meanwhile, search warrants were executed for the house and Cindy's electronic devices. Forensic experts examined the entire property, collecting ballistic data, photographing the pseudo-ransacked living room, and mapping out blood spatter patterns in the kitchen. Digital forensics came next, revealing her recent search queries about staging a break-in, the ballistic properties of certain firearms, and how to file a life insurance claim following a spouse's death. And all these tidbits of evidence began to form a cohesive narrative that contradicted Cindy's claims of a random burglary gone wrong. And throughout the earliest phase of the investigation, Cindy fluctuated between offering cooperations and evading direct questions. She agreed to some interviews, but became evasive if pressed about financial gain or extramarital relationships. The very mention of another man sparked visible discomfort. Investigators, however, continued gathering witness statements, receiving tips from church members who had noticed suspicious exchanges between Cindy and her alleged lover. Bit by bit, a different story of the crime emerged, one in which the intruder was likely a fiction created to obscure a cold-blooded plan. As details slowly trickled in, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office devoted extensive resources to the case. Detectives revisited the scene multiple times, double-checked phone records, and analyzed the trajectory of the bullet in the autopsy report. They found no consistent evidence that a genuine burglar had entered the home. Instead, they discovered strong indications that Cindy and Michael had been alone in the house when the fatal shot was fired. Having recognized the pattern of a staged scene, investigators focused heavily on proving premeditation. Their core objective was to establish that Cindy had meticulously planned to kill Michael and set up the house to look like a robbery, all so she could be free to pursue an unfettered relationship with another man and collect financial benefits. All the while, the community wrestled with its sense of betrayal. Neighbors who had once prayed alongside Cindy at church now whispered about the possibility that she might be guilty of the worst sin imaginable. Those who supported her found it difficult to accept the evidence piling up. The press wrote stories that initially framed the event as a tragic and bewildering murder. Yet the tone shifted as law enforcement started hinting at a suspect very close to home. In a faith-based town like Morris, the mere suggestion that a wife would conspire to murder her husband and cover it up shook the moral foundation of many residents. Attendance at the church events that Cindy once organized dropped, as some members could not bear to see her there while investigators swarmed around. The arrest, when it finally came, was not a dramatic nighttime raid, but a tense midday procedure. Cindy was taken into custody after detectives secured enough probable cause to charge her with Michael's murder. In the initial process, she appeared outwardly calm, but insisted upon her innocence. Some neighbors watched in disbelief as squad cars arrived at the Reese home. Detectives led Cindy away in handcuffs, her face pale under the bright Alabama sun. Within hours, the local news stations ran the headline, "Wife of Morris, shooting victim arrested for murder." On social media, the reaction was immediate and polarized. Some demanded justice, calling her a cold-hearted killer, while others clung to the notion that the authorities were mistaken. Cindy's supporters insisted she was a gentle soul, incapable of such a crime. Those first 48 hours after her arrest were critical. Investigators re-interviewed key witnesses who, now that Cindy was in custody, felt safer revealing details they had previously withheld. Several people from church came forward to describe interactions that hinted at her affair. One man, rumored to be her lover, was also questioned intensely. Although he insisted he had nothing to do with Michael's death, he admitted to an emotional involvement that may have deepened to physical intimacy with Cindy. Additional phone records corroborated these admissions, especially in the weeks leading up to the murder. Investigators pieced together a narrative. Cindy Reese, trapped in a marriage she no longer wanted, seeing a future of limited prospects, decided to remove the biggest obstacle to her new life. Forensic analysis played a key role in solidifying the case. Experts traced the bullet recovered from Michael's body back to the household firearm. Gunshot residue tests indicated that Cindy had likely fired the weapon. The staging of the break-in was thoroughly discredited by crime scene investigators, who found that the front door had not been forced open. The window that Cindy claimed was the intruder's point of entry showed no signs of tampering, and the pattern of disturbance to the living room was inconsistent with typical burglary behavior. Moreover, the electronics remained untouched, prime targets for any real thief. Technical evidence from her phone showed the suspicious searches, as well as calls to her alleged lover in the hours before and after the murder, though the content of those calls remained unknown. Combined with statements from friends and family pointing to a significant marital rift and Cindy's general restlessness, the forensic evidence effectively cracked open her narrative. The processing of physical evidence from the home further undermined Cindy's story. Investigators found footprints that matched only Michael's and Cindy's shoes. The disarray in the kitchen seemed contrived, with drawers pulled open, but their contents still carefully arranged. If someone had rifled through them hastily, items would more likely have been scattered. It was as if Cindy had studied how to stage a burglary, but lost her nerve midway, or lacked the attention to detail necessary to make it convincing. Her attempts to create the appearance of a struggle left contradictory traces in the crime scene photos. A flipped chair in one corner, while delicate items on nearby tables were left upright. As days turned into weeks, the case began to take shape in the legal arena. Prosecutors gathered statements, forensic reports, digital evidence, and motive data to build a compelling argument that Cindy had planned and carried out Michael's murder. Cindy, for her part, secured a defense attorney who initially attacked the reliability of the forensic evidence, suggesting that investigators had tunnel vision and that the alleged affair was insufficient motive for murder. However, the sheer volume of incriminating details made it difficult for the defense to argue that the authorities were chasing the wrong suspect. In the pre-trial phase, the hearing to formally charge Cindy took place amid extensive local media coverage. Television reporters stood outside the courthouse, capturing every moment of her arrival. Inside, the prosecution outlined the basics of the state's case, referencing bullet trajectory, phone records, and the questionable staging of a burglary. The judge found probable cause to proceed, and Cindy was held without bail initially, given the severity of the charge and the weight of evidence against her. Her defense lawyer filed motions to suppress certain digital records, claiming they had been obtained without proper warrants, but the court ruled that the searches were legal and valid. Family members on both sides struggled with the emotional fallout. Michael's relatives felt both devastated by his loss and betrayed by the woman they had welcomed into their home. Some of Cindy's family refused to accept that she could be guilty. Others were willing to consider that even if she was involved, it was due to immense emotional pressure rather than cold-hearted calculation. The community's opinions were similarly divided. Online forums lit up with heated debates. Church members who had once prayed together now found themselves in moral and theological arguments over guilt, forgiveness, and the nature of evil. When the trial finally began, the prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline. They presented forensic evidence first, demonstrating how the bullet matched the gun owned by Michael and Cindy, how the angle of entry suggested a surprise execution rather than a defensive encounter, and how the break-in looked staged. They called expert witnesses who explained gunshot residue patterns, ballistic trajectories, and the typical behavior of burglars, all of which contradicted Cindy's initial claims. Next, they introduced digital evidence, Cindy's suspicious search history, her texting and calling patterns, and the timing of her communications with her alleged lover. In their narrative, Cindy's motive was rooted in her affair and her dissatisfaction with her marriage. The financial angle also emerged, as the prosecution highlighted a life insurance policy that would have benefited Cindy significantly upon Michael's death. Members of Michael's family took the stand, tearfully recounting his character, his devotion, and their disbelief that Cindy, of all people, could be implicated in his murder. They described how Michael would have done anything to work through marital issues, painting a portrait of a man who had never given up on his vows. Some of Cindy's former friends also testified about her shifting behavior, her confessions of being unhappy, her hints that she wanted a drastic change. It became clear that multiple people in the community sensed Cindy was heading down a dangerous path. Few had realized just how far she would go. Cindy's defense strategy initially hinged on disputing the forensic interpretations. The defense attorneys tried to argue that ballistic evidence could be misleading, that Cindy's searches on home invasions and burglaries might have been mere curiosity spurred by widespread local media coverage of crime stories, and that the phone records were circumstantial at best. They insisted there was no hard proof that Cindy had pulled the trigger. As for the affair, the defense downplayed its significance, suggesting it was a brief lapse in judgment without any real impetus to commit murder. They further implied that an unidentified intruder could have targeted the Reese home, shot Michael, and fled when discovering more people inside. The problem was that they lacked coherent evidence to support such a scenario, and the prosecution effectively dismantled each alternative explanation. When Cindy took the stand, she appeared composed. She expressed sorrow for Michael's death, denied having planned any harm, and claimed that her earlier inconsistencies in describing the intruder stemmed from the trauma of the event. However, cross-examination by the prosecution was relentless. They grilled her on every internet search, every text message that hinted at a romantic liaison, and every improbable detail of her version of events. Under pressure, Cindy's composure cracked at times. She became evasive, even defensive, which did little to bolster her credibility in the eyes of the jury. By the time closing arguments arrived, most courtroom observers felt the prosecution had presented a compelling case. They painted a portrait of a woman driven by a mixture of romantic fantasy, financial incentive, and deep emotional dissatisfaction. Having meticulously covered up her plan, yet not cleverly enough to fool experienced investigators, she pulled the trigger in a moment of cold opportunity. The defense attempted a last appeal to the jurors' sense of doubt, urging them not to let emotions sway them into convicting someone who had only circumstantial evidence arrayed against her. But for many in the community, the evidence was anything but circumstantial. It was a tapestry of motive, opportunity, and incriminating details that left little room for innocence. When the jury returned its verdict, guilty of murder, the emotional weight in the courtroom was palpable. Michael's family openly wept, relieved and anguished at the same time. Cindy stood quietly as the judge read the decision, her expression unreadable. The penalty phase led to a prison sentence that all but guaranteed she would spend a considerable portion of her life behind bars. "What are you thinking?" Cindy said, trying to confirm whether her presence in the courtroom was palpable or not. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered, some to cheer the verdict, others to voice disbelief that someone they had known and prayed beside could carry out such a crime. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, but the sense of closure was only partial. After all, nothing would bring Michael back. In a community rooted in Christian values, the notion that a devout churchgoer had become a murderer left many grappling with the deeper mysteries of human nature. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, Morris was awash in media coverage and neighborhood talk. Longtime residents couldn't help but question how they had missed the warning signs. Some felt a collective guilt, wondering if they could have intervened or offered better support to Michael and Cindy in their marital issues. Church attendance dipped for a while, as the congregation struggled with internal divisions. Some members felt betrayed, others questioned their own capacity for discernment, and a few simply found the ongoing discussions too emotionally draining. The leadership tried to offer sermons about forgiveness, accountability, and trust in God's plan, but the emotional scar lingered. On a more personal level, Michael's parents and siblings found themselves at the center of community sympathy. Friends brought meals, organized memorial events, and offered financial support. That sense of unity was a hallmark of small-town solidarity, yet it also served as a poignant reminder of the tragedy that had happened. The Reese family eventually established a scholarship fund in Michael's name to help local youth attend college, hoping to channel their grief into something that might reflect his generous spirit. Cindy's family faced its own crucible. Some relatives accepted the verdict, albeit with deep sorrow, while others believed she was wrongly convicted, or that key aspects of her story were overlooked. A few relocated, finding it too painful to remain in a place where everyone seemed to have an opinion on Cindy's actions. The swirling rumors, the pointed looks in the grocery store, the hushed voices after Sunday services, it all became too much. Those who stayed in Morris had to learn how to live with the stigma attached to Cindy's name, a moral shadow that would likely never fully disappear. In the broader sense, the case had a ripple effect on Jefferson County's awareness of domestic violence and hidden marital troubles. Local organizations used the case as a launching point to discuss how communities can better recognize signs of escalating tension in relationships. Although Cindy's crime did not fit the classic pattern of domestic abuse, it underscored how lethal a breakdown in communication and emotional health can become. It also highlighted the importance of seeking professional help when a marriage is on shaky ground, rather than letting resentments fester until they lead to catastrophic outcomes. This is Episode 1. Several years later, the memory of Michael Reese's murder and Cindy's conviction remained etched into local history. On the anniversary of his death, friends and family organized small remembrance gatherings. The scholarship fund in his name continued to help teenagers from the area pursue college degrees, a lasting tribute to his quiet generosity. Local law enforcement sometimes cited the case as an example of how thorough detective work, combining forensic science, digital evidence, and community tips, can unravel even the most carefully staged crime scenes. From a legal perspective, the case set a precedent for the importance of digital footprints. Cindy's search history and phone records proved pivotal, convincing jurors that she had researched how to carry out the crime and disguise it as a robbery. It was a stark reminder that modern investigations rely heavily on technological traces that can speak volumes about intent and preparation. The successful conviction also reinforced the notion that staging a burglary to cover up murder rarely fools investigators for long, particularly when the staging is poorly executed. For many residents, the deeper question remained: how does someone go from a regular life, anchored in faith and community, to committing the most personal form of betrayal and violence? The answer, though complex, offered an unsettling truth. Human beings carry within them the capacity for both remarkable kindness and devastating harm. In Cindy's case, emotional discontent, a hidden affair, and a desire for a new life converged in a lethal plan. The lesson was not lost on those who examined the facts. Transparency, seeking help, and acknowledging mental and emotional conflicts might have prevented a tragedy that forever scarred the town. Summarizing the key points of this case reveals just how precarious the line is between an ordinary life and a horrifying outcome. Michael Reese was a gentle, stable presence in the Morris community, beloved by those who knew him. Cindy Reese, outwardly social and faithful, harbored a deep restlessness and eventually an affair that eroded her moral boundaries. In early 2015, under the guise of a home invasion, Michael was fatally shot in the back of his head with a household firearm. Investigators quickly noted inconsistencies in Cindy's account, from the sloppy staging of a burglary to her suspicious internet searches. The forensic evidence, ballistic data, blood spatter analysis, gunshot residue, and digital footprints compellingly contradicted her story. Motive crystallized around her secret romantic relationship and potential financial gain. Ultimately, a Jefferson County jury convicted Cindy of murder, leading to a lengthy prison sentence. The case reverberated throughout the community, prompting reflections on morality, faith, and the hidden dimensions of domestic life. The legal outcome underscores multiple implications. On a judicial level, it highlights the weight that digital evidence can carry in a modern murder trial. Socially, it exemplifies how a tight-knit community can be both a source of strong support and a place where secrets breed dangerous resentments. From a policy standpoint, the story reignited discussions on the importance of mental health and counseling resources for couples facing serious marital discord. While Morris did not pass sweeping reforms directly tied to this crime, local religious groups and community centers did begin offering more robust marital support programs and mental health workshops. Ultimately, the fallout remains personal and far-reaching. For Michael's loved ones, the tragedy is a permanent scar, that also serves as a testament to his character. For Cindy, it is a lifelong reckoning with the consequences of choices she made in desperation or malice, or both. For Morris and the surrounding areas, it is a cautionary tale about the facades people maintain and the darkness that can lurk behind them. Perhaps the enduring lesson is that even in communities united by faith, suspicion and discontent can fester. Vigilance, empathy, and honest communication are vital safeguards against the quiet drift that can lead to catastrophic acts. As for those who seek meaning in the aftermath of such a crime, many find solace in focusing on the good that can arise from unimaginable loss, like the scholarship in Michael's name or the deeper conversations about helping couples in crisis. In that sense, Morris proves resilient, turning grief into action and division into dialogue. Yet no resolution, legal, social, or emotional, can fully erase the pain of that fatal shot in the Reese kitchen, or the memory of what was lost in its echo. Reflecting on the entire chain of events, one sees the critical turning points: Cindy's discontent, her secret affair, the staged robbery, and her inevitable unraveling under investigative scrutiny. The synergy of forensic science and tenacious detective work brought the truth to light. The conviction offered a semblance of justice, though at a profound emotional cost to all involved. The tragedy stands as both a warning and a testament. Darkness can emerge in places believed safe and sacred, and even the most carefully masked deception can be unveiled through the careful work of those dedicated to the truth. In looking to the broader implications, the murder reminds legal professionals and community leaders alike that prevention and early intervention are just as important as punishing wrongdoing. Could counseling, more open dialogue about relationship woes, or timely interventions from friends have prevented this crime? Possibly. Such questions lead to ongoing community discussions about how to spot the early signs of dangerous discontent, how to create systems that encourage honesty and support, and how to intervene before tragedies occur. For those who have followed the Reese case, there remains an unsettling fascination with the motives and mental processes that led Cindy to act. It has become an object lesson in how a person can rationalize the most grievous sin when overwhelmed by dissatisfaction, fear, or longing. And it is a stark example of how easily misdirection in staged crime scenes can fail in the face of methodical police work and the digital footprints left by everyday technology use. The outcome: justice served for Michael, imprisonment for Cindy, and a deeply wounded community, caps a narrative that will be retold in Morris for years, not to sensationalize, but to reflect on the fragility of human relationships and the danger of letting hidden resentments fester until they boil over into violence. We can glean several insights from this case. First, a thorough investigative process, combining forensics, digital analysis, interviews, and logical consistency, remains the bedrock of solving complex homicides. Second, the community's reaction demonstrates that while a single crime can sow division and mistrust, it can also catalyze collective healing and greater vigilance. Lastly, on a personal level, it reiterates that the best defense against the slow creep of destructive thoughts is honest communication and the courage to ask for help. Any official review of the case emphasizes how decisive the digital trail was in prosecuting Cindy. Her phone calls, text messages, and search history served as modern footprints leading straight to the truth. The technology that ironically enabled her to plan and conceal her crime became the same net that ensnared her. Law enforcement agencies have since invested in more advanced forensic tools, ensuring that perpetrators who leave similar footprints will not escape detection. On the prosecutorial side, the case underscored the importance of methodically building a chain of evidence so that each piece, motive, means, opportunity, bolsters the other until no reasonable doubt remains. The final call to the Morris community and those reading about the case is a reminder to stay alert to the emotional needs of those around us, to remain attuned to subtle shifts in behavior that may signal something more dangerous underneath. It is a plea for heightened awareness that sometimes the greatest threats come not from strangers, but from the depths of someone's private despair or discontent. True vigilance is not about paranoia but empathy, and active support for individuals whose lives appear to be unraveling. Which leads us to the lingering question: how many tragedies could be averted if communities were more proactive in offering resources for people in crisis? Whether it's counseling for troubled marriages, therapy for mental health struggles, or simply open lines of communication among friends and neighbors, interventions matter. They can redirect someone away from the darkest path. As with the Reese case, one can't help but wonder if a timely word of counsel, a more robust support network, or even a conversation free of judgment might have changed the outcome. In the end, the Reese murder stands as a stark lesson in human vulnerability. Even in places known for their communal warmth, shocking acts can unfold when love turns cold and deception takes root. The tragedy changed Morris forever, but it also illuminated the pressing need for compassion, vigilance, and moral responsibility, values that, when upheld, may prevent future lives from being cut short under eerily similar circumstances. Michael's memory lives on in the scholarship fund and in the testimonies of those who cherished him. Cindy's fate is tied to the consequences of her choices, as she serves out her sentence and grapples daily with what she's done. The murder might have begun as a private act, a twisted solution to a personal crisis, but it ended up reshaping an entire community's sense of safety and trust. It is a reminder that the line between everyday life and unimaginable violence is perilously thin, and that the cracks that lead to such breaches can remain hidden until it is too late. If there is any small comfort to be taken from such a senseless act, it lies in the renewed determination of the people of Morris and beyond to look out for one another. In the discussions at church, in local coffee shops, in neighborhood watch meetings, the refrain remains the same. Do not let someone you care about slip away into private torment. Do not dismiss the subtle signs of desperation, and do not underestimate the power of love and support to keep the darkness at bay. These lessons, wrung from a horrific loss, are the lasting legacy of a crime that rocked Alabama's heartland and demonstrated both the worst and the best aspects of human nature. Michael Reese's story deserves to be remembered for the steadfast kindness he offered to those around him. Cindy's story serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when unaddressed dissatisfaction, emotional turmoil, and a lack of ethical grounding converge. The path from hidden longing to homicide is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a quiet, methodical descent that others barely notice, until a shot rings out in the night, and when that shot echoed in Morris, it shattered far more than a single life. It reverberated through an entire network of family and friends, altering the course of countless lives and leaving questions that can never be fully answered. In closing, the Reese case provides a sobering reflection on the human capacity for both faith and betrayal, service and violence, truth and denial. By examining each step, from the innocent beginnings of a small-town romance to the slow fracturing of a marriage, to the staging of a crime, the relentless police work that unearthed the truth, and the final conviction, one gains a broader understanding of how precarious our moral landscapes can be, and it ends, as all tragedies do, with a plea that we learn enough from it so that maybe, just maybe, another life can be spared and another community can remain unbroken. The timeline is as follows. Michael grew up in rural Alabama, embodying core values that made him a beloved figure in his community. Cindy, similarly rooted in small-town ways, craved a sense of excitement and emotional fulfillment she felt was lacking in her marriage. Their union seemed functional for years, until Cindy embarked on an affair that sparked thoughts of permanently escaping her relationship. She killed Michael in early 2015, staged a robbery that quickly fell apart under scrutiny, and left a trail of digital and forensic evidence pointing directly to her guilt. Investigators compiled an airtight case, culminating in Cindy's arrest, trial, and conviction for murder. Along the way, the community of Morris grappled with the trauma of losing one of its own, and the shock that the killer was not a shadowy stranger, but Michael's own wife. Key evidence turned on ballistic analysis, stage burglary clues, phone records, and Cindy's contradictory statements. Investigators discovered that her alleged motive was to remove Michael as an obstacle to a new life, possibly with her romantic partner, while also collecting a life insurance payout. The judicial process brought closure in the form of a guilty verdict, reinforcing the notion that no crime, however meticulously planned, is immune to the unraveling forces of forensic science, community awareness, and determined detective work. The implications ripple through legal, social, and spiritual domains. Legally, it underscores the significance of digital forensics. Socially, it highlights the urgent need for communal vigilance and resources for couples in distress. Spiritually, it challenges communities of faith to recognize that even seemingly devout individuals may harbor destructive impulses. As the years pass, the community has strived to heal, drawing on the memory of Michael's kindness and the hard-earned lessons of what happens when personal desperation turns lethal. End footnote. In a broader context, the case reminds us that the most surprising betrayals often come from within our closest circles, where trust is highest and vigilance is lowest. It calls upon lawmakers, faith leaders, mental health professionals, and ordinary citizens to remain attentive to subtle changes in those around us, to break the silence when emotional storms loom on the horizon, and to place compassion at the forefront of community life. The fatal shot that took Michael's life continues to echo as both a tragedy and a call to action. For anyone reading this account, the encouragement is to look beyond the lurid fascination with murder and focus on the cautionary tale it offers. Ask the difficult questions. Who in your life might be wrestling with silent despair? How can you support a friend or neighbor who feels trapped by circumstance? Where can you advocate for better marital counseling services or more accessible mental health resources? These are the questions that truly honor Michael's memory and address the root causes that led Cindy down a tragic path. If you have insights, questions, or experiences related to this crime or any similar cases, consider how sharing them might help others recognize the signs of a deteriorating relationship or an impending crisis. The hope is to foster understanding and ultimately prevention. When communities unite not just in the aftermath of tragedy, but in the pursuit of preventing future heartbreak, they honor victims like Michael in the most profound way possible. Do you believe a trained eye could have spotted subtle changes in Cindy's behavior sooner? Did the Morris community inadvertently overlook warning signs, or did Cindy manage to conceal her intentions too well? Perhaps the conversation should also center on the church's role in offering pastoral counseling or support for couples showing signs of deep unrest. In many cases, tragedies occur less because of sudden evil impulses and more because of a slow buildup of isolation, dissatisfaction, and secrecy that, left unaddressed, can erupt catastrophically. As you reflect on these points, you might find yourself forming opinions or questions. Share them, debate them, and remain open to alternative viewpoints. By engaging in a dialogue about the Reese case and others like it, we become more informed citizens, better prepared to intervene if we see parallels emerging in our own social circles. Above all, never forget that behind every headline is a human story, a real person whose life ended abruptly, a community left in disarray, and individuals who must wrestle with guilt, shame, or sorrow. In the Reese case, the outcome brought legal justice, but not the sort of resolution that mends broken hearts overnight. Healing takes time, honesty, and empathy, qualities that grow best in a supportive environment. As we move forward, let this story remain a testament to the necessity of human connection and the dire consequences of letting our darkest thoughts fester unseen. As we close our story on the brighter side of exercising again, I ask you to take some of what you learned on this journey and apply it to the questions facing our nation. There is no undoing what happened in Morris in 2015, but there is hope that Michael's memory will continue to inspire acts of kindness and unity, while Cindy's fate stands as a sobering reminder of what can happen when desperation and deception eclipse faith and love. Such lessons are the true inheritance of tragedy. May they guide us toward communities where no one's despair goes unheard, and where the boundary between everyday life and catastrophic violence remains unbreached.